For months now, Ethiopia has been in the headlines largely because of the conflict in Tigray to the north of the country. In trying to understand the roots of the conflict, it's suggested that some of the country's tensions lie in part due to the many ethnic groups and nations that are brought together under one national flag. Beyond Tigray, another part of the country that's seen some fighting are the Oromo. Well, to explain the complexities of ethnicity in Ethiopia, I spoke to Melbourne-based Oromo law scholar Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa.
Ethnicity is a term that is thrown around rather carelessly in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian constitutional legal language used is not ethnic or ethnic federations or anything like that. It is the detractors of the federal system that ascribe this terminology and impose this terminology on it, mostly to deride it, to call it like tribal, parochial, anti-Ethiopian, and so on and so forth. But the word used in the constitution is nations, nationalities, and peoples, and it has got a history. What it actually says is that Ethiopia is a nation of many nations. There is a famous constitutional law author, the guy who actually drafted this constitution. His name is Fasil Nahom. He wrote a book in 1997, 2 years after the adoption of the constitution, which is entitled A Constitution for a Nation of Nations. That tells you that that is really a country of many nations. And people like me who studied Ethiopia's federalism, Ethiopian constitutional law for a long time, would like to describe it as a multinational federal structure. The multinationalism comes from the fact that there are many nations trapped in that country. Now, the people who call it ethnic federalism, to kind of allude to the negative tendency, fragmentative tendency, cessationist tendency of small sub-state groups within the country, are basically people who subscribe to the ideology of imperial times. The ideology of the imperial times says that Ethiopia is a nation of one people, or a country of one nation. And this has been criticized and found wanting for many years, since the 1960s. And the reason we have this language of nations, nationalities, and peoples in the constitution is because in the 1960s, the student movement realized that the imperial project of creating one nation out of many is a failure. The imperial project of trying to create one nation out of many by dissolving all the distinct national identities and subsuming it under the Amhara national identity, which goes as the default Ethiopian national identity. That project is a failure. It wasn't inclusive enough. It was hierarchical in its relationship. It was at the expense of the other peoples of Ethiopia. One author calls them the other peoples of Ethiopia, other because they are other to the history, other to the political space, and their identities is not anywhere to be seen in the Ethiopian political landscape and cultural landscape. So the other peoples of Ethiopia were marginalized, erased, and they were not visible. And some of the people who now criticize the constitutional setup, the multinational federal constitutional setup, as ethnic, as tribal, are actually failing to see that the imperial project of creating one nation out of many, instead of preserving many nations within one, consensually, that project has failed. Haile Selassie's project failed. It is because of that. That it was basically Haile Selassie was dethroned, the monarchy was abolished, and the diversity of the country's nations and nationalities and ethnic groups was recognized. And between 1974 and 1917, when the Mengistu Haile Mariam was in power, virtually all opposition against Mengistu's regime was coming from these different ethnic groups, different national groups. the Oromo Liberation Front, the TPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front from the north, the Somali, everyone. And when Mengistu failed, what failed once again, resoundingly, was that imperial project of creating one nation out of many instead of preserving many nations in one on equal basis.
Let's look at the Oromo. You understand the Oromo people and the Oromo struggle. What is the end game for the Oromo people? Because that might help us understand what the other nations within Ethiopia are feeling.
Yeah, the Oromo is one of the nations that basically saw that the imperial project is unsustainable. It is unsustainable because the Oromo constitute the single largest group in the country, about 40% of the population, 1/3 of the territory. The attempt was to dispossess Oromos, to displace the land and the culture, the language. Some bit of linguistic imperialism was there, some bit of cultural imperialism was there, and fragment them and kind of disperse them and make sure that there is no Oromo nation as such that will survive the Ethiopian imperial project. But the Oromo nation refused to accept that, to be assimilated, to be displaced completely culturally. The language survived. And over time, it led to the organization of the establishment of a national consciousness that led to the organization of Oromo Liberation Front, which led to the armed struggle. And finally, in 1991, it prevailed over Mengistu Haile Mariam, along with other groups, the TPLF in Tigray, the ALF, the EPLF in Eritrea, the ONLF in Somali, and everywhere. Okay. The OLF, once the OLF came into the picture and Oromia was established, recognized, Oromos and all other nations in the country were recognized for who they are as a collective groups with the right to self-determination recognized in the constitution. Then it was said that this time it is going to be a consensual coming together of peoples. So the many nations that had issues before with each other, the nations that were hierarchically secondary before, are now coming together to be owners, co-owners, co-founders of the state, the Ethiopian state. And once the collective agency is restored, the right to self-determination is recognized, it will be a free association of independent nations. In this situation where everyone is co-equally a founder, co-owner of the Ethiopian state, the end game for the Oromo is to have a democratic dispensation in which, at least through democratic votes, because they constitute the largest group in the country, there will not be losers in a democratic Ethiopia. So they kind of suspended the interest to secede. And that's the case with ONLF, the Ogaden. That was the case with TPLF, which had actually prevailed over the state. They could have seceded back then when Eritrea seceded. They said that's not the end game, because in a democratized Ethiopia, in a federal Ethiopia, where all nations are recognized, collective agency is asserted, and self-determination is recognized. And people can walk away unilaterally if they so wish through a referendum. All right? If that is the case, secession is not anything that we aspire for. Because to be together and coexist peacefully with others will actually harness the energy in the region and create a stable Ethiopia, which also creates a stable Horn of Africa, and so on and so forth. So for a while, the Oromo and the other nations had suspended the interest to go away. But now, where is it going? Given the fact that this war has simply pushed Tigray out of Ethiopia, literally. It is very difficult today to look at a Tigrayan in the eye and say, we need to collaborate and work together in Ethiopia. It is very hard because every kind of evil has been perpetrated for the last 5 months and more, and no other group, no other region from among the 9 could somehow stand up to Abiy Ahmed and say, no, this is not happening. So they are in despair now. They said, we don't want to have anything to do with Ethiopia. And mind you, the Tigrayans are the constituents, the co-creators of the old Abyssinian kingdom, which became the Ethiopian empire at about the end of 19th century. So once Tigray steps out of Ethiopia, there is no way that the Oromo would now say, hey, I have to take the burden of preserving Ethiopia for the Amhara. It's just unthinkable. So now people are beginning to consider after Abiy, what? What? So do we still try to work for Ethiopia, or do we want to form our own state? But this is not spoken about clearly, but people are considering this as an option.
So given the history that you've described, do you think that the Ethiopia project as it is now can hold to have one super nation with a group of nations with this ideal of coexisting and a great deal of self-determination? Is that genuinely possible given the tensions that are playing out?
If we disarm, demilitarize the politics, because the question of, the war in Tigray is a political war. It's about politics. It's whether the Ethiopian core wants to subjugate the peoples of the periphery, And if this is, if this is political, then you have to find a political solution for it, rather than a military solution. In other words, if the Ethiopian government, whoever controls the center, first demilitarizes the politics, secondly, democratize the state, get into election, an inclusive, free, fair, and competitive election. Even if you want to secede, if you have that as an agenda, once you have a government that has a democratic mandate, you can table Article 39 of the Ethiopian Constitution, which talks about self-determination. And then you can legislate towards a referendum, and then the people would decide. But if two things, demilitarize the politics, disarm your arms, and democratize the state, meaning be inclusive, sit down and negotiate, talk about a roadmap towards electoral democracy, have that election, and say everything else is going to be played out as per the constitution. If we do this, the Ethiopia project will, of course, succeed. It lacked only one step in 2018, which was having a democratic opening for once, a democratic election. Once people have that opportunity, that they can make or break their governments through their votes, and they can go out when they so want through a referendum, through a vote in a referendum. And when they know that nobody is going to turn the tanks against them for deciding whatever is politically plausible for them, Ethiopia project would have worked, and it would have become a genuine voluntary association among the disparate groups in the country. But now, instead of democratization, we have gone into a restoration of the imperial project that pits everyone against each other. That's why you see the Amhara national regional government going everywhere, trying to fight all the wars that Abiy Ahmed is fighting. It is an assertion of the attempt to restore the politics, to return the politics of empire. If the politics of empire is to be played, and if military tools are going to be part of the political game, then the project, the Ethiopia project, might as well be collapsing right before our eyes as Tigray decides its destiny, and the rest of Ethiopia either dissolves into a war or a civil war, an interminable civil war at that, or the stronger ones come out and unilaterally declare their independence. But I still am a believer. Demilitarize the politics, have a democratic state, have an election, just pull out the arms out of the politics and the political equation, let it play on a popular consent basis. Ethiopia is a viable project still. However, given the level of despair people have, given the level of muscle flexing coming from Addis Ababa, and the clamoring for hitting upon them and killing them, murdering them, etc., from the Amhara special forces. That's the kind of noise we hear every day in the name of Ethiopia. If that is how it is going, muscle flexing from Arakilo, which is the center of the palace, and show of force from the Amhara region, and militaristic politics, as long as we pursue this, probably the Ethiopia project is not going to survive this time, because people are really desperate. People are really mutually suspicious of each other.
So we have the Prime Minister, Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He himself is Oromo, I believe. Surely this is a man who would understand some of these nation within nations tensions and the need perhaps to find that middle ground. Why is he having difficulty in doing that?
Well, he is a self-identifying Oromo person. He was born and raised in Oromia, and that's why he's also a member of the political party called Oromo People's Democratic Organization, and that's the party that catapulted him into power. And so, for all we know, the Oromo People's Democratic Organization is a political party that struggles for the freedom, equality, and social justice, achievement of social justice of Oromos, for Oromos. But given the fact that he came on the back of the Oromo protest movement, promising to address the demands of the Qeerroo Oromo, which is the young people of Oromo who were in Oromo protest, one would have a hope that this time the Oromo will be centered rather than alienated and marginalized. Unfortunately, Abiy Ahmed, on the aftermath, on the very first day he assumed power, and in his inauguration speech, he unleashed the politics of empire. That day, one of the things he said is, now is a time for the return to the glory of the olden times. And as I have just told you, pre-1974, Ethiopia's nations have an uneven relationship, a checkered relationship. One scholar calls it a ranked relationship. There is a first-rate citizen, there are second-rate citizens, and some of them are in fact slaves. The darker-faced people were seen as slaves, okay? And this racialized kind of differentiation still plays out when you see the violence in Benishangul Gumuz, when people refer to the darker-faced peoples of Ethiopia as Shankilla, which is Blackie, if you like, which is the slave. In the past, it was the Blackie that becomes a slave. So there is a racialized, hierarchical relationship among the groups of people in Ethiopia. When you talk about return the glory of the olden times, everybody knows that pre-1974, this is a country of citizens and subjects. Some are citizens and others are subjects. And people were immediately picking up on that statement and saying, what glory are you talking about? And for all we know, even Ethiopian scholars describe Ethiopia's legal history, Ethiopia's political history, as the agony and ecstasy of Ethiopia's history. There is an article by Ivo Straker, The Agony and Ecstasy of Ethiopia's History. What does that mean? For some, it is ecstatic, the glorious. For others, it is an agonizing history. Most Oromos who hear me now would say, this guy is not even an Oromo. This is Ethiopianist. The reason is because an Oromo, because of the agony vis-a-vis Ethiopia's history, wouldn't even raise this issue and talk about the northern history of Ethiopia. So, given the fact that this is the nature of relationship in Ethiopia, when he said, this is a time for us to return to the glory of the olden times, that moment he ushered in what I call the return of the politics of empire. From that moment on, through collaboration with other Ethiopianist, parties which I consider to have an imperial nostalgia, really. In collaboration with them, he basically railed against, number one, the multinationality of the country. Number two, the federal structure of the country. Number three, the self-determinationist constitution. So he said, we are going to change this. He said, excessive nationalism is destroying the country. Therefore, we have to move away from identity-based or nation-based politics, and therefore we don't have to insist on such political parties which are liberation fronts, etc., etc. When he began that, he had immediately veered away from his Oromo constituency, and the Oromo automatically disowned him. First of all, they didn't know him before. He came under the shadow of Lamma Magarsa. And secondly, the politics he plays is precisely the politics that the Oromo has been fighting for years. And he came at a moment when the Oromo considered themselves at the cusp of victory after all those protests. He came basically as a counter-reform measure, if you like. So we say among Oromos now that the revolution is hijacked, the struggle has been stolen, and now the victory has been redirected to bring in not a democratic reform, but rather a return of the politics of empire. That's why Abiy alienated himself from the Oromo constituency. The second thing, and that's where he happens to have only these wars to manage ever since he came to power. The reason he is fighting with the Tigrayans, the reason he is fighting a war in Oromia now, is because he said to destroy this identity-based politics, the most difficult fronts are Tigray and Oromia, because they've got liberation fronts who sacrificed immensely to make sure that in the very least, they will have an autonomous self-governing region within a federation, in the very least. When you talk about no need for identity-based politics, ethnic-based politics, or whatever you call it, sometimes pejoratively, when you say there is no need for this, and I'm going to change, or I'm going to stop this, that moment, what you cannot stop is the nationalist sentiment in Oromia, in Tigray, among other places. And because there have been fields which have been struggling, rallying around liberation fronts, he said, we have to crush these two. So I think 6 months into his reign, he launched a war of eliminating the Oromo Liberation Front from Oromia. And 2 years after he assumed power, in the name of law enforcement, he launched a war against Tigray. And it went on. He had done the same in Sidama. He had done the same in Laita. We were looking for a statehood within the federation. And there have been violent repressions in those places. About 157 people were killed in a day in the Sidama region. Although later there was a referendum and they achieved their statehood, and on and on. So it is his posturing and his propagating the nostalgia for empire that is alienating him from the Oromo public and becoming him a disowned constituency-less individual figure now.
And I'm going to focus on the Oromo people just because of their size and significance, and you understand them being of that nation. Are all Oromo on the same page in terms of the way forward? We've seen the military wing of the movement move away from the political wing. So one gets a sense that even the Oromo are not agreed on the way forward for the Oromo nation.
There are many Oromo political parties. There is, for example, the Oromo Liberation Front. There is the Oromo Federalist Congress, and there are other smaller parties which almost are disappearing nowadays. At least between these two, and the third is, of course, Abiy's party itself, which has transformed itself from a nation-based party to I don't know what, to a prosperity party now. So at least the two major parties have one thing they agree upon. The very minimum thing that Oromos as a nation expect in their life in Ethiopia is to be a self-governing state within a federation. The protest over the last many years wasn't about for secession per se. It was for self-rule primarily. If this is a federation, then we need to be governing our region without any interference from the government of Meles Zenawi and the others. And it is about benefiting from our own resources. It was about having a pride of place for our language in the country. You know, they thought the Oromo language to be a co-working federal language, the working language of the federal government. These were the kind of questions they were asking. If you look at these things, and of course, protection from eviction, arbitrary eviction, protection from loss of land and abuse of our environment, and so on and so forth, access to their own city, Addis Ababa being an Oromo city, but Oromo being virtually pushed out, literally evicted from the places, and so on and so forth, dispossessed and displaced from the city. These were the kind of questions they were asking. All these questions, if you sum them up together, there will be one thing: social justice. They were demands for social justice. The Oromo Federalist Congress, basically, one of the largest political parties, originally modeled after the ANC. I'm sure you relate to it. It was called ONC, Oromo National Congress, virtually modeled on Mandela's ANC, because this is the large majority. It has a large majority constituency. Therefore, if we democratize this, then freedom cannot be achieved. You know, just like the ANC said, if Africans just vote as first citizens, then all will be solved. Now, this is the OFC now. There is the other one, the Oromo Liberation Front, which started a liberation struggle, armed struggle, because they said the imperial state of Ethiopia, beginning from the 19th century, was basically a colonial state. Colonized, as far as the Oromo in the other nations are concerned, it was a colonial state. And the way to decolonize a country is to use self-determination. And this is also the same interpretation that Tigrayans use. To decolonize an empire, you have to use self-determination. This is the global thing. So the Oromo people, at least the OLF now, which is operating in Addis Ababa, says the Oromo people deserve a say to determine their fate, whether they are within Ethiopia or they want to be away. So they don't say we want to secede, but we want to make sure that our people has the potency to vote on their destiny. That's the principle of self-determination. Until that happens, we need a self-rule within the federation, okay? And if people have to decide on their destiny, we have a constitutional framework which has not been implemented so far in their view, because Oromo has been oppressed irrespective of the fact that there was a constitution that is very liberal. And so there is a constitutional principle, and to call for a referendum is not even our thing. It's not even a political thing now anymore. It is a legal thing. It is in the constitution. So this is the thing that they say. So one says social justice priority, and through social justice, we can liberate ourselves, we can empower ourselves. The other says we have a self-determinationist project, but self-determination has never been implemented. The Ethiopian constitution recognizes it. We wait for the moment when that can be implemented. Now there is a breakaway group that hasn't put down the arms and fighting from the jungle. This group was not fighting at the beginning when Abiy came to power, when OLF came from Asmara, which it was operating in Eritrea. When they came in, they put their arms down, and they are saying, they said, we're going to take part in the politics freely as long as the political space allows that to happen. And then soon enough, Abiy reneged on his agreement with them. There was a negotiation going on in Asmara, and he reneged his part of the obligation in relation to how to demobilize, compensate, and reintegrate the Oromo Liberation Army with the Ethiopian army or the Oromia police force. He didn't want them at all, and they were waiting for that. And when he didn't want them, a particular breakaway group that was basically conducting a guerrilla fighting in the southern and western periphery, they said, if this is the case, we're not going to disarm ourselves. They held on to their guns. When they did, Abiy found an excuse to march against them. Not just them, but also the OLF that is operating democratically and peacefully within Addis Ababa. And in fact, Abiy has been on record going to IGAD meeting in Kenya, asking the Kenyan president to eliminate OLF and Al-Shabaab so that Horn of Africa will be a peaceful and stable and prosperous area. So in fighting that breakaway group, and the breakaway group is not talking about cessation. The breakaway group was saying the terms of negotiation, the terms of integration into the Ethiopian National Army are not respected by Abiy, and therefore we are not going to let go of our gun. And then, of course, now that you are coming against us with force, we are going to defend our people with force, and they have stuck to their guns, and they are now really fighting a deadly fight with Abiy Ahmed. So, do the Oromo stand on the same page? I think yes. It's a broad church of political parties, but it is between social justice, referendum, and self-determination, constitutional, and federation. Social justice, referendum, and federation. Because cessation is not something you have to aspire for politically in Ethiopia, because it's a legal matter. You don't have to discuss it politically. Cessation is only if there is democracy. Cessation is a matter of implementing the law and facilitating referendum. So people often think that the Oromo issue, or Oromos are divided about cessation. Of course they are divided. That's why they need a referendum. Those who want to be in and those who want to be out have to be sorted out through votes, but they didn't have that chance. And so what happens now, what exists now as a demand among the Oromo political parties is, one is for social justice, the other is for a self-rule in federation, the other is for referendum to decide our place in Ethiopia.
That was Dr. Tsegaye Ararssa speaking to me from Melbourne.